Hello everyone, today we talk about medieval work and in particular production. There is some hefty content I made on medieval work. You can find that mostly in the Medieval Society playlist. You know that I'm no structuralist, I loathe materialistic history, and obviously this is anything but that. However, you should never sort of confuse, let's say, the necessity of traditional belief without the material element within it, how spirit intertwines with matter indissolubly in the fallen world. These topics, of course, are mostly technical, so we will stick to a social and economical history that you can accompany with, again, all the playlists I made specifically about medieval economy, peasantry, etc. So when we study medieval production, it's of course important to identify the sectors that had the greatest quantitative significance in the system. I will mostly stay for this reason within Europe and mostly in the West, because that's where overwhelmingly wealth and labor was concentrated, and to understand how, of course, work was organized within them. Now, reliable estimates regarding the number of workers during the Middle Ages, but even before the 18th century, to be honest, are largely unavailable. As a consequence, we're deprived of the clearest indicator of the impact of various industries in the economy. However, there have been estimates made, for example, by Cipolla, suggesting that it's reasonable to believe that at least in the earlier centuries, agriculture absorbed something between above the half up to the, say, 90% of the active population, despite the presence of craft work that supplemented agricultural labor. A substantial part of the remaining population that was not working in the field was still engaged in sectors that met the demand for textiles, clothing, and construction materials. These were particularly concentrated in urban areas, as you understand, because that's where the surplus arrived and could be worked to begin with, but not only. This demand was largely a result, of course, of low income levels, typical of the pre-industrial societies, which focused primarily on fulfilling basic needs such as clothing and housing. However, the production and trade of foodstuffs can be viewed as comparable to agriculture in significance. Importantly, this does not imply a lack of specialization or even less a limited range of products. We've seen how this really worked within the so-called courtly, manorial, seigneurial system that wasn't a closed economy at all, right? On the contrary, the labor landscape of especially the late Middle Ages was characterized by considerable, let's say, dislocation of activities. Some would say fragmentation, but that sounds, in fact, too fractal, considering the incredibly well compact, organized, and framed economic system on which all these, divided business operated because of their own individual entrepreneurship and proper private property, etc. Not something that actually shows us a broken system. As a matter of fact, the moment of greater fragmentation was also at some point the peak in the 13th to 14th century of medieval economy and the great medieval civilization as well. During the later Middle Ages, you have more compacted, let's say, activities under more rigid frames that the post-14th century crisis and regime had established, and would last, in fact, mostly within, especially and under a monarchic direction, up to the 18th to 19th century. And so, let's say that this divide corresponds in many ways also to the wealth of the system, the quality of its product, as it would manifest with the advent of new fashions or techniques, for example, contracting during these times of reduced demand. For example, in the mid-13th century, which was definitely that moment of booming economy, Paris shows us from the Livre de Métiers, so the book of the crafts, the statutes of over 100 different professions in the city alone. Right? It admittedly was very big, but still shows how articulated, in fact, economically speaking, the very capital of the largest, most powerful kingdom in Europe really was. Particularly from the 14th century onward, the emergence of what can be described as a superfluous consumption among a broader segment of the population led to a further diversification of professions, at least related to clothing and home furnishings. People actually were more dependent on bigger, let's say, enterprises. However, these were allowing organically, rationally, for that further specialization. Also because in the later Middle Ages you have an increase of elite and long-range economy, trade, commerce, which really necessitates further refinement, the improvement of technical skills and systems of production. In some cases, investigations into the number of workers across various production sectors have been conducted through, for example, declarations or censuses carried out for fiscal purposes. This, for example, in the Italian communes were known as the estimates fundamentally. Nevertheless, it is important to recognize that documents arising from fiscal sources do not entirely capture the reality of the labor market. As you understand, we are in a pre-modern statual situation in which, in fact, you can have, of course, sometimes even very thorough, in fact, pre-modern ways of really calculating the population's property, yield, etc. However, the same fact that, for example, we don't have this for all polities, and that some of these were actually very rich and intertwined also with one another economically, complicates the absolute just provided by the estimates. The terminology used in these documents is also often imprecise. We don't have to think about that level of standardization that we know in much more recent contemporary administrative systems. Typically, only the profession of the household head was recorded, for example. So, giving an idea more or less of who was who and what he did, leaving the potential work activities of spouses and children unaccounted for. As we will see now, family business was actually a very compact and fundamental aspect of medieval economy. So this datum by itself, you see, it's mostly dictated by the taxation needs. So the households, for what they were more or less, not just about reconstructing the accurate economic condition of everyone involved. Despite these limitations, these records offer a general overview of areas with significant economic activity. They, in fact, are present in the more developed parts of Europe for us to observe, and can illuminate the unique characteristics of local situations, particularly in regions that extend beyond mere urban districts as well. So something that was becoming already statal in nature, or had already become to some extent. This is something that we discussed in other videos, but it really depends on which polities and when. Such areas, however, may have provided clear pathways for specialization as regional states and markets began to develop, especially towards the end of the Middle Ages. By the end of the 13th century, Paris had emerged as either the largest city in Europe, or the second was either Paris or Milan. However, her economy was not dominated by a single productive sector, in contrast to the cities of Flanders and those in central northern Italy. This is really relevant because Paris, of course, was the capital of a great feudal kingdom, and it was just so big that it would naturally attract, if anything, as a large market, such annexed professions. Conversely, especially Flanders, this from an early age, due to the fact that they, as you know, imported English wool, and they exported it to actually the very northeastern French Champagne fairs, and so more or less also within the orbit of Paris, and the Italian communes in part would specialize in textile production, thus prevalently. The central northern Italian city-states are something much more complex than the Flemish towns. In fact, the former were ruled by a veritable state, right? An actual governmental body representing all the sort of quite stratified political and social system of these also much larger centers on average. And the latter, instead, were essentially bourgeois-run communes within still a sort of feudal system whereby the Count of Flanders had some control. Fundamentally, just the main three, Ghent, Brugge, and Ypres, towns that didn't have that also enormous public state building and, for example, professional standing armies like the Italians had at that point. So as a consequence, the latter's economy was much more articulated. It's probably wrong even to call them, say, mercantile republics. That's some sort of snobbish, modernistic obscuration of the fact these were veritable states at some point of the same size of the major Western monarchies in size. Speaking of armies, financially condition, their guilds were much more articulated. So I made lots of videos on these topics. We talked about the Flemish towns, we talked about the Hanse, we talked the Italian communes especially. You observed how public debt worked in relation with the army. I made a video comparing the Baltic and Mediterranean trade in the second half of the 14th century. So you have a lot there to watch aside from the videos, strictly speaking, on Italian trade and finance. And this point, it can make you understand by scale how actually diversified these communal productions actually were. However, yes, textile production dominated. Speaking of these, these comparisons regarding Paris, for example, of the 15,000 arts, so households of taxpayers recorded in the city's tax rolls, approximately 5,000 were artisans. And among these, more than 600 were involved in the wool textile sector, in addition to workers in linen and silk. So Paris is actually a very good example, albeit being, again, a massive city, perhaps the very largest in Europe, however, dominated by a monarchic seigneury, right? So something extremely different from, again, a city that is an actual state on its own, would have such diversified crafts themselves. Furthermore, around 400 individuals were engaged in construction on the basis of the same evidence. Despite the considerable dispersion, let's say, of these trades in Paris, textiles also in here constituted the largest group, even though the city did not possess a specific production focus during that period. So more or less, by scale, they were doing the same that the Flemish or the Italians were doing. Now, by the early 15th century, Verona, in northeastern Italy, made a series on Veronese history during the era, was a medium-sized city. By, of course, the Italian standards, it was actually pretty big for the European average. Had a long-established tradition in wool manufacturing as well. Among the over 4,000 recorded families, approximately 2,500 reported engagement in various professions, while the remaining 1,500 derived their income from land. Right? Remember that in medieval cities, the establishment is made up of landowners. And these are the people who are essentially ruling, not very differently from, say, feudal states or estates. Also outside the larger centers, at least. Through their, also the same kind of lifestyle. It was essentially military in nature. Now, within the Veronese population, 714 individuals worked in the wool industry, and this number could rise to 923 if we include those in clothing trades such as tailoring and embroidery, which is over 1/3 of the active workforce. Verona's textile production was actually quite important, and the city had specifically come up from that, mostly at least, the same Scaliger dynasty actually that would become one of the most noble in Europe. They married into the imperial house. They became imperial vicaries for northeastern Italy. The Trevisan mark actually had originated from the textile industry themselves. Now, beyond textiles, the next largest group in Verona within the non-agricultural arts, that is guilds, made a video also on the Italian guilds / arts, crafts, whatever you want to call them, consisted of leather workers. Consider those videos we made on contemporary Italian warfare, showing the famous cuir bouillie Tuscan Angevin style. In this case, actually in Verona, it should have been different. It was an era under greater Ghibelline and German influences, but of course that kind of armor was developing pretty widely in general, and we shall actually make a video about the so-called Milanese armor in general to show how articulated in fact, in the highest, the most advanced arms and armor production in Italy, really, northern Italy really was since the 12th century. We see within the same leather production specific specialties such as tanners, furriers, shoemakers, saddlers, totaling about 250 individuals, which account for 1/10 of the whole. In comparison, those involved in construction-related trades, such as bricklayers and carpenters, were less, numbering only 160. The remaining heads of artisan families, roughly 500, so 1/5 of the whole, were engaged in a diverse array of trades, highlighting the diversification of the labor market during the Middle Ages, mirroring the complexity as the advancement of the system. Similar trends were observed in other Italian manufacturing cities. For example, in Florence, over a half of the workforce was engaged in production and trade by the 40s of the 15th century, while areas with a stronger agricultural focus saw this figure remaining below 1/5. Naturally, Florence was particularly prosper and financially and commercially dynamic. Center, to say the least, in the 14th century was literally the richest city in the entire globe. In this center, the textile sector employed 1/5 of artisans, while leather working only, say, less than 1/10. Pisa, with her burgeoning leather industry, and textiles employing around 1/10 of her workforce, and leather comprising pretty much the same. Meanwhile, a smaller center like Pistoia, that was also under Florentine in Germany, had an economy marked by a significant metallurgical workforce, which represented, however, 1/20 of the population. Nonetheless, the textile sector, along with its various branches, remained the largest and most economically significant, which explains the worker uprisings and rebellions in cities that occurred in the second half of the 14th century. I think I just made only one video at the very beginning of Schwerpunkt on this topic. Essentially, the drapery industry became this leverage that the fort estaters used to obtain certain political recognition, civic rights before they were actually put down, and actually ending up in a much worse condition than they were before. This is how essentially the affirmation of the ancien regime manifests, especially in Italy, in Flanders, because these centers were specifically invested in textile production. This entailed this levels of pre-industrial, quasi-industrial capacity, as a matter of fact, where lots of these workers in the cities were active. Now, workers during the mid-14th century crisis increasingly found themselves reliant on powerful merchant entrepreneurial corporations. Notably, the revolt movements in Flanders and Tuscany during the 14th century have often been compared with the most significant being the Florentine tumult of the Ciompi in 1378. The Ciompi were the wool workers, the salaried workers of the woolen industry, to say better. This there were different dynamics. Phenomena actually talked about Flanders regarding to this, and mostly the relation of the local towns with the comital power, the feudal authority, that eventually brought to the collapse of the system and the Burgundians actually taking over the Netherlands, which is essentially a consequence of that. Thing I was saying before, that these were probably not city-states simply capable of defending themselves. They end up under somebody else. In Italy, it's different. Basically, the local government just puts down these movements. And the fact that the most significant was in Florence, and especially in Tuscany, that had a more Republican bias compared to Lombardy, I think speak volumes about the general context in which these revolts could occur. Right? It is true that Tuscany had preserved this greater idea of citizenry that actually had not much to do with the same revolts of the Ciompi in a direct sense, but this means that the various aristocratic families that run the commune would actually exploit this fort estaters' violence to obtain something within their balance before they got rid of the same, because of course nobody cared about them and wanted them to rule, even less the city, absolutely, God forbid. In feudal countries, you have, like in France, the Jacquerie, for example. In the same period, the West follows this. Then Central Europe has later on just things like the Hussites, the Peasant War, but it comes in a later phase that mirrors the fact that they had to still sort of socially develop to an extent, and also in different ways. The important, though, being that in other areas, this thing does not quite happen, right? These are always conflictual societies, but the forces involved are different. Say, the great lords of northern Italy, for example, have heavily fortified their cities. The Tuscan, say, so-called republican governments did exactly the same, just to a lesser degree. And also, this is very important because they had more of a financial than strictly military hegemony. on the various centers. We will see this better as we have to go on, by the way, with the series about medieval Florence that will explain this better. But you can check this out in the videos about Milan, seeing how they dealt with the general control of the subjugated cities in that case. Now, the metallurgical sector was notably influenced by the presence of mines concentrated in particular regions of Europe, as well as by fuel availability. We've seen often this. We don't talk much about mining, but of course in our videos about Bohemia, think about Kutna Hora, as well as, I don't remember exactly where, there were of course scattered in different places. For example, iron came from mines in Upper Palatinate, the Eifel, Styria, Lorraine, the Upper Rhine. We're talking this actually also about the Habsburgic monarchy, like in early modern times, and they're not so far away, telling the truth. Copper and silver mines were present in Saxony, Bohemia, and Hungary. At this time, they were witnessing an increase in production. In Italy, the primary mining area was located in the Lombard Alps, where also the famous, in fact, Milanese arms and armor industry was concentrated, followed by the iron mines on the island of Elba in Tuscany that, as you know, dated back in exploitation since Etruscan times. The availability of these precious raw materials fostered a robust metallurgical industry in southern Germany and northern Lombardy, including cities such as Milan, Brescia, and Bergamo. As we will see, these areas will become, especially by the 15th century, really the center of European-wide arms and armor production. Of course, other countries had their own arms and armor production, but the Italian and the German styles would predominate. We will talk again more specifically about Milanese armor. We've seen already in places like the Balkans, Hungary, etc., how Italian and German armor was imported by the oligarchs in there. The Italians had this primacy since the 12th century and maintained it throughout or the end of the Middle Ages, particularly the aforementioned cities. Before that, arms and armor production, since the migration era, was concentrated in the Upper Rhine, right? Gradually shifted to Lombardy, and then in the later Middle Ages, also because of the Venetian contact with southern Germany, that is a very important cross-continental route that was used with the decline of certain more traditional Western routes. Brings also in southern Germany to the spread of certain models of arms and armor entrepreneurship in connection with broader markets, etc. The Milanese production, which included a wide array of specialized goods, from sewing needles to armor and small metal parts, thrived prior to significant competition from German expansion, which began to intensify from the 15th century onward. Despite cities housing artisanal workshops with advanced technological capacities, iron and steel production also saw considerable rural dispersion in mining regions, particularly regarding semi-finished goods and agricultural tools. Economy historians have developed theoretical models to explain the various forms of productive organization that emerged from the Middle Ages to, say, the 18th century. And these frameworks are sometimes ridiculous. That's also why I have a veritable idiosyncrasies towards so-called socio-economical, or even worse, even just merely economical history, as if this was anything close to being decisive or something. That pig of Karl Marx, a disgusting son of a bitch, building on the classical economist's tripartite division of productive factors, that is, according to his dirty words, land, capital, and labor, outlined for lesser people 3 chronologically successive phases in labor histories: craftsmanship, manufacturing, and industry, that of course coexisted at all times, preceded by, according to his chicken brain, a more primitive phase of rural domestic industry. Now, later discussions adopt, so in a completely historical reality that sort of doesn't make sense because, he had to scan this and categorize because that's how materialists try to imagine reality in any case. In fact, later discussions by other structuralists, also Marxist influenced but somehow more intelligent individuals, adopted still on this pretty thorough sense of development of productive economy, such as Fernand Braudel's four-part model in which he split further, like he mostly addressed family businesses and workshops. That is to say, decentralized laboratories or scattered factories coordinated by merchant entrepreneurs, centralized factories with minimal investment, and the factory system based on machinery, which is also very sort of abstract and talking across many eras, many realities, and so suffering too much of that pig of Marx sort of chicken brain effect. Now, aside from production for self-consumption, the dominant mode of production during the late Middle Ages was craftsmanship, especially in the wool textile industry, which was often complemented by a dispersed factory system, that is the Verlag system. This doesn't mean that, of course, other activities weren't there, and this still doesn't describe fully how they differ, for example, from the ancient world, or even like the later Middle Ages, right from the peak of medieval civilization to the early modern period. Documentation of course, some sort of more industrial activity is scarcer, especially before the 16th century, but there are, of course, cases of such industry. For example, the Arsenal of Venice being the largest portual facility of the time. But think even just about Gothic cathedrals, right? So we're really looking at massive, but I mean really massive productive activities throughout the entire Middle Ages. Even when you look at the High Middle Ages, you would be surprised by how actual investment was placed in, especially naval enterprises during most of the Middle Ages. Hell, we had to finish Gothic cathedrals in the 19th century in Europe for how big these things really were and how like modernity hadn't had the means to accomplish that fully compared to medievals that had in many cases also done so, right? Just to spit, of course, again on that pig of Marx with great pleasure. Now, the dominant method of production during this period was craftsmanship. Craftsmanship involves the market-oriented creation of goods in a workshop by specialized worker who may operate independently or with a few assistants, apprentices, or paid laborers. So when you look at the workshop, you realize it's sort of very complex business connected with these other echelons of society, often in a hierarchical fashion. Again, the governments we were indicating before, for example, in communal Italy, had evolved from such oligarchic business, being born literally from the military activity together with probably the industrial one and etc. It was all unavoidably intertwined. We'll see it much better in other videos. And that's why also politically there's no such thing like it's about a class struggle or whatever. There were estates, competitions, and conflict, of course, but they were also always split vertically, to say the least. And so that's not a valid interpretation of the war. In any case, the workshop is important because this is essentially the basis for much of that sort of more developed production that would bring medieval civilization to the peak of mercantile activity and still fundamentally go on throughout the modern age. It was the place where production and sales occurred concurrently. placing dual responsibilities on the same craftsman. One was to the work itself and another to the customer. With the exception of wool textile production that we'll talk about at some point, this entire production cycle typically unfolded within the same workshop. The unique features of artisan enterprises have sparked considerable debate, because also in this case we do not have an enormous documentation on all the actual workshop activity in the Middle Ages. However, it definitely is a very debated topic, underscoring the ongoing challenge of establishing a definitive model. This complexity can be influenced by, of course, various issues, including ownership of the same workshop, the possession of raw materials, the professional specialization obtained through the apprenticeship system, and this just sticking to the strictly sort of economical side of the story. We're not talking about the political and social ones, of course, are much more important than the economical ones alone. Regardless of such differences, it is widely recognized that the primary condition for all craftsmen was, in general, we're talking the West here, right? Professional autonomy. This mirrored the foundational Romano-Germanic sense of civic liberty and the ways it had been declined, especially in the more advanced parts of Europe. The liberty to serve customers without being dependent on a client who controlled, for example, the raw material. This is something that emerged from feudalism that had never, however, been absolute about this at the same time, and that had actually contributed to the development of the other parts of the system when it had taken on, especially in the moments of greater difficulties for the continent, sort of dirigistic direction, and always with the support of the estates. If a craftsman worked directly in a client's workshop, their role would be more accurately defined as that of an employee, of course, relying solely on their labor, at least in that relationship. Now, in practice, it was not unusual for craftsmen to switch between different working arrangements depending on their individual circumstances. Today's video is in very broad terms, of course. The significant diversity of the medieval labor landscape makes it risky to simplify this intricate reality into a limited set of characteristics, particularly given the occupational mobility, especially at lower levels, being commonplace. Many workers alternated between the roles of entrepreneurs and wage earners. Craftsmen often preferred working alongside family members, their wives, typically the daughters of other craftsmen, as well as their sons and daughters. Thus, the family unit emerges as the fundamental core of the business. This is a family business, and it is really at the root of medieval economy, guiding the apprenticeship of sons in their father's trade. We've seen it in many videos, from the ones of the Capitatio, Jugatio of Diocletian's times, the ones, of course, that gets further affirmed by the Constantinian sort of solidus quasi-feudal system. We've seen it even in the videos about sword making. During the migration era, the secrets were passed down from father to son, but the Smiths, families that worked for, other, say, more Apollonian, Uranian figures compared to their underworldly realm, we can say. When the father was unavailable, or to enhance productivity, apprentices and possibly wage workers could be engaged to bolster production, but this also depends on how much they had in order to actually do it. And of course, their familiar relations did help, but they were not overly stretchable. Apprenticeship was a defining feature of the medieval labor system. as it should really be today. An apprentice would be placed with a master craftsman by their father, mother, or guardian to learn the trade, living with the craftsman's family for several years, as stipulated by trade customs and guild regulations. Apprenticeship contracts often contain terms resembling those of servile labor, as, of course, learning the craft was a privilege and not just a simple opportunity. And so it was incredibly important for the same craftsmen to have this skilled aids that would be, in fact, an investment in the future production. Analysis of contracts from the 13th to the 15th century reveals numerous variations within the same trade, of course, including differences in relationship duration and the apprentice's status within the craft. In the 13th century, completing an apprenticeship typically allowed the apprentice to become a master craftsman. However, this certainty waned in the latter part of the 14th century and into the 15th, as guild entry became more restrictive, favoring the sons of masters and relegating other skilled workers to secondary roles. This is, in fact, the product of the 14th century crisis that we always refer to, the true affirmation of the Ancien regime. There are literally adult human beings who believe that, the Middle Ages was sort of a more oppressive time than the modern era. This is not how it happened, and even when it happened because the Fourth Estate screwed up, right? They had the means to actually earn their place in parliaments, in being an actually successful part of the system. They failed badly. They tried the violent way to disrupt the entire hierarchy, and they were beaten down in every single damn revolt or revolution that they staged, and they remained under for like half of a millennium. So this is very interesting because it shows that the people who remain at the top definitely knew how to defend their own quality and proven it over these other groups. And so everything becomes more oligarchic in nature. The entire system has collapsed. This has shrank to a degree. Medieval civilization lives on in what we call improperly the modern one that never existed. It arrived straight alive until the 18th, the 20th century, depending on where we're talking about. Except it had been sort of internally contracted. It had not essentially managed to consolidate further especially the universal powers dimension. And so in order to salvage the stability of the system, this becomes more oligarchic in nature. And so if in the 13th century you could simply say, okay, there was so much growth and opportunity, you could it was still a hierarchy, and so you had to go work for a master, but you would hope, also because these often were father and son respectively, to succeed, in fact, your master at the guidance of this, because it was, again, a much more, unregulated also system. There was, like normally in times of growth, this greater opportunities for individual entrepreneurship. A couple of centuries later, everything changed, right? To be part of the productive system, you had to either have some very high specific competence acquired through knows which means, preferably, in fact, working for someone else and not having really the capacity to rise too high unless it was, in fact, within the same hierarchy provided by these people that kept, however, most of the income for them. And so maybe providing you actually maybe a good living, maybe even a better living, considering how, say, more violent the 13th century was, compared with how people were much more involved, also politically, militarily, etc. But of course, in a much more controlled way, so in a way that, in part, checked much like the same autonomy liberty of individuals, still making the system grow gradually. Actually, they saved the system, preserving it like this. It just took a while before, after the major crisis, things could grow back once again. And there was a greater extension of control, probably also from a territorial point of view, like political systems were compact. That's the reason why, as we were observing before, regional states they did maintain still this great level of specialty variation, because they were sort of more scientifically and more controlledly needing for this or that skilled craftsman for a very specific place that they created for him. While not universal, it was common practice for apprenticeship agreements to be drawn by a notary, a figure that in fact grows dramatically exactly in these centuries, since the 12th, the 11th, depending which areas. It's been calculated that in the Nievole Valley in Tuscany, 1/3 of the local population was involved in the notary business. And so, of course, this is an exception because of a great wealth, trades, literacy, it's per capita wealth we're talking, especially concentration. Now, primarily, these notary agreements were a great accomplishment in the history of civilization. We talk this mostly from our medieval law series perspective. It was mostly connected with commerce, with trade, right? Not much just the state per se, but still relative to these transactions. Primarily to ensure the master had access to the apprentice for the entire agreed duration as well, which was an important issue. Otherwise, this person had to sort of repay the master in some way. Because it was, again, an enormous investment for the times, yields. This often included clauses against abandonment, predictably, especially once the apprentice became capable of contributing effectively in the workshop, and so could, for example, leave just to start his own business. In exchange, the master craftsman that had lots of responsibility pledged, in fact, to teach the apprentice the art of the trade, and if possible, provide a small stipend in the form of clothing or money, together with some sort of general protection, if you want. The system did really work like the mob, like in the absence of a sort of modern, fully centralized state. These people are the ones that sort of leave, pray, go to church, go to work together, right? So they share also in this craft, so like a deep connection at a personal level, because still it was a traditional mentality so much. We were remembering it before about the swords, for example, was connected to the idea of a supernatural capacity that was being learned there and exercised. In the case of this, again, salaried contribution from the master, this could be considered really a real stipend, right? For female apprentices may also include domestic service. Women did work sometimes also in very physical works, and were, at least on average, paid less than men. However, naturally their primary societal role was somewhere else. Mostly they would work a lot even, but within the household, within the home, the same fields. In addition to hiring apprentices, the shop owner often employed paid labor as necessary. Paid workers are an ambitious category, naturally. When does paid labor come into play, and can we actually refer to workers in the medieval city? Sort of doesn't make much sense to ask. One, of course, can look at the piecework compensation in the late medieval documents indicating a subordinate role versus an autonomous one. However, the presence of paid labor in the manufacturing cities of central and northern Italy, for example, marks in general a significant departure from many transalpine cities where masters had to rely solely on apprentices. As we were saying before, the Italian city-states really put together like an unprecedented level of societal and economical capacity as far as production is concerned. The government is heavily involved in all this, and so there is an unprecedented level of protection, of regulation, of control, of security. Both fully qualified craftsmen without their own workshops and unskilled laborers often found themselves in a position of dependency also as a consequence, because the system beyond was much more sort of expansive in absolute terms, so there was a really powerful force behind it, not just the average, again, saying before, like the apprentice in a workshop run by a master is also like a guy that represents like the third estate, running the town, but still in the face of a feudal lord. Right now, here we're talking states that are basically investing in their own production, and they're doing it all by themselves, all across the estates in a unitary fashion. That's why it's really unprecedented. Compensation, however, was determined by personal negotiations. This is also relevant, and it shows the degree of vibrancy that you do not find, for example, in the Byzantine Empire, that had sort of big central power, but sort of very scarce entrepreneurial potential, and the Italians themselves at this point had actually taken over, especially in a broader financial or commercial way. Although governments throughout Europe, especially after the demographic crisis of the mid-14th century, enacted regulations setting maximum wages to curb worker demands during labor shortages, there were no universal standards for trades, right? Unlike those established for actual day laborers. This phenomenon has been particularly evident among construction site workers, where existing documentation has enabled thorough analysis. So the workshop, again, is even something you really want to be connected with if you are really to be in the craft to begin with. Unlike the construction industry, masters did not always possess fixed structures in there, and some crafts necessitated expensive facilities as well, such as dye works or forges. When feasible, such as in the case of weavers, tailors, and other artisans working with relatively small tools, much of the work took place in the craftsman's home. Alternatively, it was common for artisans to visit clients or operate within their employers' workshops. Clearly, having fixed resources that could be leveraged in times of need made one's business more economically robust compared to those who relied solely on a few basic tools. In cities, various specialized trades tended to cluster together, enhancing oversight of work quality and discouraging unfair competition. There is an anonymous Genoese poet of the early 14th century, so really the peak actually of such medieval commercial civilization, expressing such sentiment. In Genoese, it sounds something like this. This is vernacular. Per le contrae sunt le botteghe ordinai, che quelle che sunt d'un'arte stan quasi insieme de tutte parte, which means by essentially the various quarters are the workshops are ordered in a way that those who are of a specific art, specific craft, are together almost in every case, right? And where they are. This also reflects pretty well how sort of like from the bottom up this growth had been in these centers, how autonomous and thriving such especially maritime centers, but not only really were. Genoa, we talked about her, at this point was one of the major naval powers in Europe. And this zoning of activities often depended on specific requirements, such as access to running water or the heat to locate polluting or fire risk enterprises, such as dye works, tanneries, blacksmiths, forges, or furnaces in designated areas. This required both the aforementioned autonomy and government intervention. the interesting thing, and especially in a city like Genoa, it was very privatized in power, also at the governmental level, is that indeed the same people who run the government, of course, were the ones at the head of these guilds, and or at least of specific ones, like clienterally speaking. And so this enormous activity would always be funneled within the same political and military ambitions of the Serenissima. Actually, not only Venice was called like this, also Genoa. Such zoning was a defining characteristic of the urban landscape, as you understand, not just during the Middle Ages, but it would continue to do so during the Ancien regime. Right? If you look at Paris or Berlin, for different reasons, you have to imagine, just as nice examples, like something incredibly different from what you can see today. You have naturally like more medieval towns all over Europe. You have, especially in central Italy, a lot of that sort of medieval fabric, say urbanistic fabric still evident. The same Rome was like that, right? It was a massive medieval city, all fortified, etc. Unfortunately, in a sense, or fortunately in another, for what we have instead, of course, in the Renaissance, this was mostly surpassed. But just think how actually close and sort of, typical such scenarios really were, right? And also how you could instinctively understand what was all this compaction about spatially, right? I'm preparing a video, incidentally, on the fortifications, especially the city ones of the Italian communes. So giving you this idea that the city in general all over Europe was a universe within itself. The world was outside and outside the city, manifesting very different ways for those naturally inhabited, depending where in this repartition. However, we should also exercise caution when attributing the origins of, for example, certain quarters and urban names to the Middle Ages. Because while some were established in later periods, some actually derived from the same Roman times. And so there is also a massive history of archaeological certification that we tend to give a bit for granted. There is definitely a continuity of the Roman guilds into the medieval ones, and that's a topic I made a video once. I think I have to re-upload the specific video, but that is actually very poignant as far as the urbanistic continuity is concerned. It is also unlikely that all practitioners of the same trade actually resided within a single district. Just this was a tendency. Again, we're talking about very big cities here. We're getting to the hundreds of thousands. So you can imagine how complex it was and how, say, irregular the same settlement of different guilds and workshops, etc., really was within a certain space. There was all kind of intertwinement. However, it is true that tendentially there was this grouping. For certain sales activities, particularly for meat and fish, city governments required vendors to concentrate in a single market to ensure quality control and just hygienic precautions to begin with. So obviously enough, the governments tended to invest in such favors to the local mob, if you want, because this would have brought much greater advantages to the local economy, and so more trade, more possession to tax, etc. This is always the case. This is true also for the nobility, and so today we do not talk so much about, for example, aristocratic economy. That was, as we've seen recently in a video about the early 17th century Habsburgic one, very much based on the large estate ownership. We'll talk that mostly about in the videos. In fact, about medieval countryside and peasantry, agriculture, etc. But they were also very much interconnected at the same time. As we said before, all these guys who were at the head of the major guilds were landowners. Because at the end of the day, not just the city existed literally because there was a surplus from the countryside, but because also the city could not be ruled but by those who also controlled that, right? They were the same people at the same time, right? It wasn't much of a subjection. It was that probably the urban elite, the patriciate, especially in later medieval times, that marries with royalty and etc., is really that higher and at some point highest level of wealthy ruler that is truly a citizen. All these features definitely highlight the complexity of the medieval labor landscape, where a myriad of skill levels and organizational forms coexisted in a hierarchically organic as successful system. Except for wool textile production and construction related trades, the entire production cycle from raw materials to finished products was typically completed within the workshop. However, myriad specializations emerged, especially in high value sectors such as metalworking. While blacksmiths could produce simple agricultural tools, the manufacturing of intricate armaments, made a bit about the coat of mail for example, demanded specialized processing for each component of armor and weaponry. Certain techniques were closely guarded trade secrets, monopolized by the cities where they were practiced, which is often an underrated aspect. In fact, for example, in Milan in the late 13th century, there was production of brass bells and the decorative spotted armor that really pertained to the Milanese masters' secrets. Additionally, the diverse trades involved in leather and fur processing exhibited a high degree of specialization, even if this did not always manifest in corresponding corporate organizations. The reason is also obvious, right? The more you earn, right, the more qualitative your product to begin with, the more resourceful you are in order to produce it, and so to control also the entire process. Of course, there would be always some sort of dependency for the same tools of single workshops on somebody else's craft to some extent, but things really tended to be organized within the same systems. For cheaper products that could sometimes stem from the fact that those who crafted them were not really making a higher quality, but they were more competitive price-wise on the market, things got more fragmented. Crafts such as saddles, sword seats, harnesses, parchments, and footwear illustrate the extensive applications of this raw material, which extended beyond clothing and home furnishings, as evidenced by the various artisan categories involved. In examining the production methods, the second model is that of the dispersed factory or Verlag system that Brodel was sort of identifying. Now, this typology has been particularly associated with the wool textile production, and is characterized by an exceptionally lengthy and complex production cycle for high-quality fabrics encompassing everything from yarn preparation to cloth finishing. While not all operations were carried out for cheaper fabrics, wool mills featured a division of labor into several distinct stages, including yarn preparation, weaving, fulling, and shearing. This is really typical of Northern Europe, of Flanders at least, because of all the trail that connected them with England, as we've seen, and with France and beyond. Why does this happen? Because there is indeed a major wool export from Britain that say the Flemish collectively, regardless of their, in fact, political divisions, for example, at the town level, as we were indicating before, are invested in, right, monothematically, we could say. Thus, in the bigger flow of trade, of production, like, it was just, say, easy for anyone out there to invest in producing your own share of crafted elements in order to specialize in this or that part of the working of the final product that you would know would always be searching for on that specific market. All right. So less political centralization brings to different people still being part of this wall, because the economic drive was so strong that just the market absorbed it. Hence the dispersion, right? Dyeing could occur, for example, at any stage on wool, yarn, or fabric. The complexity of this process necessitated the involvement, of course, of an entrepreneur who organized the work as a whole. So there could be different communities, different households that were workshops invested in this, but they would, of course, be controlled by bigger mobsters of sort. As the work could not all be conducted within, of course, the single workshop, and so you needed just an intermediary, somebody specializing in putting all this together. Some phases, such as spinning, were assigned to women external to the company, which also entailed, in fact, literally home production. So contributing, again, as from the lower estates, from within the same home, to this broader activity, while others, such as fulling, drawing, and dyeing, required specialized facilities that were more costly and larger, and these were, in fact, usually the ones run by the merchant, manned by at least other people who had enough resources. Although the same entrepreneur might operate both fulling and dyeing establishments to an extent. Consequently, these decentralized factories employed both permanent workers assigned to the entrepreneur's art of wool, we could say, workshop, and external craftsmen who worked either from home or in their own workshops, as well as in fixed facilities like drawing mills and fulling mills, for example, owned by the Wool Art Corporation. This was the case, for example, in Tuscany, where this also occurred. Again, also there was a major focus in terms of the refinement of wool textiles. Consider that in the 14th century, with the crisis, lots of Flemish people emigrate to Tuscany, bringing their own crafts and putting them at the service, as we've seen in these bigger guilds. And at that point, the Flemish cloth that was very, in fact, well renowned, to say the least, is successfully copied and even surpassed in quality by the Italian manufacturing that had entailed also the participation of these Flemish workers. And this is very interesting, by the way, and that shows you also how after the mid-14th century crisis, things were sort of becoming more interconnected in all over Europe, even though this example in particular is mostly like a matter of personal mobility rather than say elite connections. But in the meanwhile, definitely the Flemish and the Tuscan connections were, at an elite level, were intensifying. Also because, as we know, the Italian merchants at that point have literally started founding banks and branches pretty much all over the West. Now, within the workshop, the initial phases of production of this bigger sort of composite process were carried out by wool workers known as, in Italian, for example, we have divettini, right? These were essentially carders, combers. The famous ciompi that we remember before in Florence were, in fact, the same types. The selected and prepared wool would be processed by wage earners called scelteni before being spun and woven by spinners and weavers. After fulling and drawing, the cloth would be returned to the workshop for final finishing. So they had means to literally provide these people with the part of the unfinished work in decentralized places, and sort of once this was over, like they would bring it back to the major workshop. This tells you how organized the system was. Now, before the widespread epidemics of the mid-14th century, a surplus of labor contributed to low wage levels and greater stability in labor relations. In contrast, by the end of the 14th, a system based on piecework and high mobility prevailed. During this latter period, workers frequently moved from shop to shop, performing their tasks wherever needed and receiving wages based on the quantity of the work completed. This is important because it actually shows how much of their power they had lost as individuals, needing to move now in order to get paid to begin with. This is, in fact, the period in which the aforementioned textile industry salaried workers had rebelled and had basically also been put down because they hadn't been able, in fact, to impose more advantageous forms of exploitation for themselves. The largest merchant companies were directly responsible for improving raw materials and could establish a distinct wool art sector, employing workers or partners who oversaw the production process. You understand how this gets ever more sort of stratified and controlled, as we were saying before. To produce high-quality fabric that was ever more demanded by the enriching elite all over Europe, and competing almost about this luxury, the raw materials had to meet certain standards to begin with, to be readily available to satisfy demand. So this put in motion, through the same wealth of these elites, in fact, lots of other work on which other people depended. So actually, European economy will come back, or expanding, actually consolidating and sort of strengthening back again, becoming especially less exposed to market fluctuations. Because before the 13th to 14th century, the major cracks of the banking system in the early 14th century, nobody had really created before this time probably the check measures for coping with major, also because they mostly owned everything to privates, right? At this point, instead, the state steps in heavily because they are the same establishment, as we were saying before, as the other, say, that business autonomy had sort of shrunk to an important degree. So major manufacturing centers like Flanders and central northern Italy imported wool from England, Spain, and Provence. These were, especially Spain was the largest, Castile in particular, the largest wool producer by far. Right? It was also southern Italy, but that was not so invested in this broader cycle. In any case, especially the mess that had produced those enormous exports, and you realize here how paradoxically, even though by this point the Champagne fairs, for example, are dead, the Rhone Valley say highway is impracticable because of the 100 Years' War, the English chevauchée in Occitania, the interdependency of the different countries is actually enhanced. If anything, it's different trade routes that change. For example, the aforementioned southern German, northern Italian connection, especially with Venice, think about the Fondaco dei Tedeschi, is a deep product of this rearrangement of, like, before they would pass through the Rhone, they would get to northern France. Now France is engulfed in a major crisis, the war is on. So the Genoese are ousted also by Venetian and Aragonese cooperation. They open the Atlantic route to reach England from the Gibraltar Strait and the Atlantic Spanish-French coastline. The Venetians opened the Alpine route, because they reinforced it with Bavaria. You have all these interesting shifts. Always bear in mind that the major axis of trade, and this we'll see it in another video, would remain still at this point between the east and the west, passing through the Mediterranean, Italy, etc. Only a portion of the finished products was intended for the domestic market. again, international contacts are really consolidating and extending far and wide. These circumstances clarified the dominant role of merchants and the influence exerted on trades within the sector of merchant corporations. The system is getting very much also fluidified through banking and essentially mechanisms that would remain unchanged until the 16th century. As previously noted, the textile industry was a crucial driver of urban exports as well, where of course the greatest manufacturers were concentrated, and the entrepreneur's expertise in producing woolen fabrics, as well as cotton and silk, was vital for achieving significant qualitative advancements, especially from the 13th century onward. Right? In absolute terms, this export shrinks in size, but qualitatively speaking, relatively, it's much more refined, it's much better, right? And this, of course, is a broader consequence, again, of that political recompaction, especially at the regional level, that social control that occurs after a crisis is largely also voluntary and unavoidable, given the general crisis and the need for this greater regional control that could help the same workers. Consider that the entire statal development between the 13th and 14th century is designed primarily to protect the community. Essentially, the productive activities are suffering of wars, of the lack of police, of centralized justice, even just something that can be permanent and reliable. And so gradually, these are also the same people that contribute for these governments to establish themselves. And of course, the mid-14th century is the Brusker moment. That's when you have the greater issues also with the revolts of the salaried workers that, however, again, go nowhere, notoriously, and end up actually sort of exhausting the system, again, of this elements of perturbation, for which the system stabilized better. So naturally, it's all very important to browse in this way, but at some point we will have to, if anything, look at things a bit more in depth in the individual, as far as the individual aspects are concerned. On Schwerpunkt, I have often engaged in this kind of, okay, let's start from the bigger picture, because it's important just to frame it accurately and then passing to the details. Otherwise, people lose the perspective. Paradoxically, on Schwerpunkt, since I grew over time, this means that less people will actually watch these introductions that are going to be older compared to the more in-depth stuff, but I guess that, at least to a degree, the basics will keep getting more views than the details, especially as far as socio-economical history is concerned. As you understand, it all flows once you understand exactly what happened, especially if you have a pretty solid understanding of the political and social history of these countries also, and always comparatively. The notion that you can sort of understand history just through economics is ludicrous, and even not just socio-economical aspects are concerned. You must mandatorily be enforced to study political and social history, and military one as well, before you even dare think, which you will have been trained, in fact, enough at that point not to do, that economy has actually anything to do with reality taken as a sort of monofactorial abstraction of the picture. You can not understand that. It's pure materialism. It doesn't lead anywhere in economy, by the way. It's not driven to begin with by that sort of ethos for which you must forcefully study the moral reasons behind it. And so just economically, you can't quite do it, right? That there's not just like as we are unfortunately trained to reason nowadays, some sort of strange machine that works, and we just have to understand the mechanisms of the machinery, but what makes the machinery move to begin with and for which purpose. The rest is materialism, Marxism for mentally deficient people, and as I always say, this is not a channel for lesser people to begin with, and always remember that the discriminant is moral, right? Classism is, again, just for people that want to be lesser people, and being a lesser person is never an excuse for being a lesser person. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.